ultimately, trade is like water. When countries put an obstacle in the form of tariff and non-tariff barriers, the flow diverts.
Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, warning of a slowdown in global economic growth.
We need a more resilient world economy, not a drift to division.
As the IMF and the World Bank meet this week in Washington, D.C., the Trump administration's shakeup of the global economy is likely top of mind for many global economists. But how do these 80-year-old financial institutions impact trade and economic development around the world today? What does the future look like for those nations hoping to wield or maintain power? And what about the countries hoping to get a foothold in the global marketplace? Let's dig into it. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, the World Bank and the IMF. I'm your host, Christopher Walljasper in Chicago. First, a bit of history. In the summer of 1944, the US and 43 other nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were looking back at the first half of the 20th century. It was a time of economic depression and global war, and they wanted to find a way to rebuild from the destruction of World War II and move beyond an era of economic barriers and protectionism.
In recent years, large parts of the world have suffered from the effects of uneven growth in some of the...
Two global financial institutions came out of those meetings: the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, now known as the World Bank. The UK's Prime Minister Harold Wilson back in 1964 touting the value of these groups.
The institutions created at Bretton Woods have proved their worth.
In the subsequent 80 years, the two institutions have lended to countries big and small in moments of financial crisis and helped developing nations hoping to grow their economies. But in recent decades, the IMF and the World Bank have faced pushback for some of the conditions that come along with financing. To help me unpack all of this, I've got two of our economics reporters. David Lawder covers global trade and economics for us. David, how long have you covered these institutions?
Better part of a decade that I've been sort of in the international economic space, covering IMF, World Bank, and trade. And right now, it's the craziest time that we've ever seen in this space.
And Karin Strohecker from London, she's our chief correspondent of emerging markets, which she's also covered for more than a decade. Karin, how have the last couple of weeks been on your beat?
Well, the last couple of weeks have been pretty breathless, I have to say. The news has moved so dramatically fast. But I think policymakers around the world have had a really tough task of coming to terms with what the new global backdrop looks like and how they should align their own policies and how they should interact with everyone else on those.
Absolutely. All right. So I want to begin with some global economics 101. I think when a lot of people hear International Monetary Fund, World Bank, they don't exactly know what these organizations do. So David, let's start with you. How would you explain these institutions to the average person?
So these two institutions were created after a period where there was a lot of what they called beggar thy neighbor economics, tariffs upon tariffs on various countries, which worsened the Great Depression. The IMF is really kind of what you call the lender of last resort. So when countries get into fiscal trouble, no one's willing to let them borrow in the markets. You go to the IMF and you seek a loan. And with that comes conditions. You have to make economic reforms to spending, to make yourselves a bit more friendly to investment, market-based reforms, that sort of thing. The World Bank is the development lender. So you think of it as the IMF is macro, the World Bank is micro. The first loan that the World Bank did after World War II was to rebuild a steel mill in France that was destroyed during the war. They've lent for development projects, for dams, for power, for any number of different infrastructure projects, things that help countries build economies. So the World Bank has had a big focus on fighting climate change in recent years. And this was an initiative that the Biden administration had pushed to try to shift more of their lending and increase their capacity to lend for energy transitions and other climate-related issues. The Trump administration, that is quite out of favor.
So a lot of developing nations are on the receiving end of these loans from these two institutions. But what do those countries who are putting money into the World Bank and the IMF gain from contributing to these institutions?
Well, basically what wealthy countries, which are the main shareholders of the IMF and the World Bank, what they get is a much more stable global economy, one that's more conducive to growth, one that's more helpful in terms of job creation, in terms of exports. What they also get is influence. At the end of World War II, when these were created, part of the goal was to make sure that we develop in a market-friendly way. They were fighting communism at the time, so that helped Europe and quite a bit of Asia to develop market economies.
Yeah. Karin, I guess that's an interesting point. The globalization we've seen over the last 30, 40 years has in some way been funded by the World Bank or the IMF. How has that contributed to what we've seen in terms of emerging markets over the last few decades?
So, yes, that's right. Emerging markets really rely on globalization. They rely on trade. They have a lot of times a very much younger population, and they need that job growth in order to keep stable economies and a stable society. And the trade disruptions that we see really will be very, very harsh on emerging economies. The uncertainty has made pretty much every investor to bring their money back home. So that's flown out of emerging markets. And that puts them in a really tight spot.
That's interesting. Now, I wonder, when we talk about emerging markets or developing nations, are there any nations that, because of the influence of the World Bank or the IMF, grew into a more established market today?
So emerging markets covers a huge sway of countries, right? And there's various definitions of it. South Korea, which, arguably is a lot more developed than even some of our developed economies, down to the likes of Lesotho, which have found themselves in the crosshairs of the latest Trump tariffs. So there's a huge breadth of countries here. I think the reforms that are instigated by the IMF when a country comes into a program is often what helps these countries to bring their debt on a more solid footing, to bring their currency markets on a more solid footing, and that helps them out of what can often end up being a very difficult position otherwise.
Now, when it comes to countries on the receiving end of IMF or World Bank funding, Argentina is top of mind. Earlier this month, Buenos Aires was approved for a new $20 billion IMF loan. There's hope that the financial infusion, alongside President Javier Milei's chainsaw economic reforms, can help curb triple-digit inflation and pull the country out of recession. But even as Milei's reforms have shown some signs of stabilizing the economy, it's also caused already high poverty rates to climb to more than 50% last year. At a market in Buenos Aires, dozens of Argentines rummage through dumpsters filled with fresh produce, sorting salvageable corn and squash to bring home to feed their families.
Ver gente que viene a rebuscársela como se viene ahora, nunca vi.
Jose Rolando Aylan says he's never seen people scrape by like this. He especially feels sorry for women who come with their children looking for food. This latest $20 billion IMF loan is not Argentina's first. That was back in 1958 to the tune of $75 million. Now it's borrowed a total of $177 billion over the last 67 years. IMF loans back in 2018 and 2022 rolled over payments from previous programs that failed to halt Argentina's economic troubles. Employment in Argentina has improved in recent years, according to Agustin Salvia.
Teniendo ya estabilizada la situación, la inflación ya en un 2%.
He's the director of the Social Debt Observatory at Argentine Catholic University. But Salvia says that those jobs are more precarious, informal jobs. He says Milei's reforms haven't had significant changes to the employment picture in the country. Now, after decades of loans, defaults, and debt restructuring, the people of Argentina have mixed feelings about the latest $20 billion agreement. Some see it as a sign the global economy trusts the path they're on. But older residents who've seen cycles of debt over the decades say they worry they'll be left with nothing to retire on in the coming years. Now, Karin, how has the recent economic uncertainty impacted some of the nations that use these institutions for funding?
Well, I think just to give you a bit of context here, so we call the smaller, often seen as riskier emerging markets, so-called frontier markets, right? And what we have seen due to the turmoil that's recently happened in the global bond markets in the past couple of weeks is that the borrowing costs for these countries have risen dramatically. And at this point in time, it will be very difficult for them to actually go to global financial markets and to borrow money. So you could say that if that situation as we have it right now, that borrowing costs are so high for these very risky countries, that there will be pressure for them to maybe turn to the IMF in bigger numbers. However, we don't yet know how transient the current situation will be. That has very much the potential to put more pressure on smaller and riskier economies.
So the IMF and the World Bank, this funding contributes to an increasingly global economy, right? And, the idea of global markets and free trade, that's come under a lot of pressure in recent weeks, especially as it contrasts with Trump's America First agenda. So, David, how does the Trump administration view the IMF and the World Bank?
Right. So the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has not made too many comments about these institutions. But one of the things that's raised a lot of questions is Project 2025. This is the Republican manifesto that Trump had distanced himself from during his campaign, but a lot of which is coming to fruition. And one of the things in there was for the U.S. to pull out of the IMF and the World Bank and instead do development and aid financing bilaterally with countries in order to make sure that U.S. interests were front and center.
So how are the World Bank, the IMF, responding to the possibility of a shift from the U.S.?
So there's been a fair bit of engagement between Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, and Ajay Banga, the head of the World Bank, with Scott Bessent, to sort of make their case as to why the U.S. needs to really stay engaged, stay involved with these institutions. And one of the things that we're seeing from Ajay Banga is last week he talked about his plans for energy investment and other development operations. The pivot for the World Bank has been to kind of talk about creating jobs in these economies. And he was talking last week more about things that you can do that are sort of climate focused, but not necessarily solar panel clean energy projects. It's more about smart development, climate mitigation, building roads that don't get washed out in hurricanes and that sort of thing.
Now, it should be noted, it's not just the Trump administration that is criticizing the IMF and the World Bank, especially when it comes to the reforms that they demand on the countries receiving the loans. Karin, tell me about the pushback and how these institutions respond to that.
Well, it's a very fine line because if you need to turn to the IMF and you need to get money from the IMF, that comes with these sometimes very stringent conditions. such as you have to higher your tax intake, you have to lower your fuel subsidies. That immediately hit people on the street who often, when these countries are already in trouble, are already suffering. And that can cause all sorts of social unrest. And we have seen that in a number of countries in recent months and years. We have seen, for example, Kenya was forced to roll back some of the tax plans they had because of the huge protests, and that has to some extent delayed and or derailed some of its interactions with the IMF.
Well, I wonder then, given the fact that right around 16% of their funding to these institutions comes from the U.S., how are the World Bank and the IMF preparing or anticipating U.S. involvement in the coming months and years?
There's certainly no immediate indication that the U.S. is going to pull funding in the same manner that they pulled funding, say, from the USAID Development Agency. But one of the funding issues that might start to emerge this year is the quota arrangements for the IMF. And every so often, the IMF has to rearrange its shareholdings to reflect different shifts in the global economy. The rise of Brazil, China, India, those big emerging markets. They've been clamoring for a bigger share, especially China. I think any rearrangement of the quotas is going to probably give a bigger say to several of the big emerging markets. But the question is, who gives up share in that case? Thus far, the U.S. has been reluctant to do this. And I guess one big litmus test for U.S. commitment to these institutions, will the U.S. pony up more money in order to keep its share stable? There's been talk lately about the Europeans taking a bigger say in these institutions. Certainly in the IMF, the traditionally Europe has chosen the managing director. There's not really a big appetite to see their shares go down. So this is going to be an interesting dance. It's not an immediate crisis, but it's something to watch on the horizon.
Well, and Karin, that makes me think, just as David kind of mentioned that conservatives in the U.S. Want to push for more bilateral and one-on-one arrangements, we've seen that already with China and their investment in developing nations. So does the breakdown in the IMF or the World Bank really reflect the influence that's happening in some of these emerging markets already?
Certainly, China has been very strategic in its investments and its interests and how it goes about engaging with emerging markets on this. Of course, the best and biggest example of that is the One Belt, One Road that has seen a huge amount of infrastructure investment in very strategic locations. So yeah, are we going to see more of that bilateral? Looks like that would be the direction of travel. I mean, we have seen, for example, the US making noises about a critical minerals deal with Congo, which would be in very much a bilateral deal. So are we going to see more of that? It looks pretty likely at this stage.
Do those bilaterals, are they necessarily in conflict with the activities of these institutions, or would the IMF and World Bank actually prefer that there be these bilateral, more quote unquote open market deals before they come to, say, an IMF?
Well, I guess your question is interesting because you said open market. And the problem is that a lot of this lending that is going on bilaterally, we actually have very little idea about the terms and conditions that are attached to it. And often that actually emerges how little we know about it when a country really gets into trouble and needs a debt restructuring. And all for a sudden we go like, oh, there is big amounts of debt to, let's say, a Chinese development bank or to Saudi Arabia or to India. There are many players actually in that space. And the reckoning comes when the music stops and you need help from an international institution that might really demand transparency.
So I guess given some of the criticisms we've seen from the Trump administration, from other populist leaders, not just about the IMF and the World Bank, but globalization writ large, do these institutions need to exist in today's economy? They're 80 years old at this point. What would the global economy look like without these institutions?
Well, possibly would look a lot more fragmented. I think those countries who have something to offer, whether it be minerals or, whether it be some other raw materials, commodities, might find themselves in a much better position than others who have possibly less to offer on that, sort of international marketplace where these trade-offs and investments happen. And I guess what then follows, if you have a more unequal society globally, we see all sorts of secondary effects from that. We see refugees making their way to other destinations. And, of course, it is in everybody's interest that emerging markets or developing economies get richer, because on the other side, that also makes a market to sell into.
Karin, David, thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
A big thank you to Karin, David, and all of our economics reporters who cover the global economy. If you want to read more about the World Bank and the IMF and the spring meetings happening in Washington, D.C., check out Reuters.com for all our coverage. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Gail Issa, Jonah Green, David Spencer, Sharon Reichgarson, and myself, Christopher Walljasper. Senior producers are Tara Oakes and Carmel Crimmins. Our executive producer is Leela DeKretzer. Sound design, music composition, and engineering by Josh Summer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to podcasts.